as I'm walking home, I've decided to talk about lineage, right? That's a very important matter. People fail to value. Lineage is a nasab in Islam, basically the line, your bloodline, through your father, through his father, through his father. You call that the paternal lineage. My bad. My apologies. So, with regards to lineage, I'd like to talk about certain points. Yeah. The first thing is that a lineage is very important in Islam. This is clarified because there are many traditions that point out towards this. You have the verse in the Quran which says وَدْعُوهُمْ لِآبَائِهِمْ هُوَ أَقْسَطُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ, which means call them by their fathers. That is more just by God. So the verse did not say call them by their place of birth or their travel document, the passport. The verse did not say call them by their mother's lineage, right? The verse did not say call them by their favorite country or call them by their hometown or where they grew up at. Nope. The verse said call them by their fathers. So your lineage comes from your father, through your father, right? And when the Sharia, as in sacred law, when it talks about lineage, it is talking about that paternal bloodline. And that's the fourth one, or the third one, according to different scholars, right? Each with their respectful opinion. When it comes to the objectives, the Sharia, the five, the religion, that's the first, the deen. The second one is life. The third one is al-aql, reason. The fourth one is lineage. And some people, some scholars or jurists or traditionists categorize it as honor. Fifth one is property. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man gharaba an abihi fahuwa kafir." Basically, that translates to whoever runs away from his father is an ingrate, as in he's not grateful. And the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, meant lineage by that, right? So we have so much traditions, we have so many verses that highlight the importance of lineage, but why? What's the point? Because it keeps people close together. It preserves the ties of kinship. And if you wish to enforce morality in society, you would need that preservation. For an example, I'd highlight an example here. I'd like to highlight an example. Let's say, if I were to tell you, right? If I were to say, there is a person that is in that nightclub doing drugs, God forbid. Would you care? No, because you might think that's just some typical stranger. Why does it matter? Right? You won't care. That's the reality of the affair. If I told you that was your cousin, then you might care a bit more. If I told you that was your, let's say, brother, then you would care even more. Because now you know this person and you know he's harming himself and you worry for him because you have this relationship with him, this blood tie with him. And then if I told you that was your son or your daughter, then you might actually go into that area and drag them out, right? You would enforce morality. You understand? You would literally enforce morality. Why? Because of the blood tie. And that's how lineage preserves morality, keeping the ties of kinship. It is something that is very important. Today, if you look at the West, you see it's the height of individualism. People do not know who their cousins are. Families are smaller. They live separately. Nobody knows who their neighbors are. It is not like a small village anymore, where the whole community knows each other. There is no preservation of lineage. I mean, if you were to look at the Arab tribes, they preserve their lineages very tightly. They have some heavy, deep ethnocentrism, right? And that's why you find more morality over there usually. But if you go to the West, nobody knows what tribe. There are no tribes anymore, because people don't preserve their lineage. And that's why immorality, that's why debauchery, right? That's why the degeneracy of values, they spread so much in a society. Do you understand? Because there is no enforcement from any of the people who share the same blood, because they don't know about each other, right? This is why it's a very important value. It's very important to preserve your lineage. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, he said that if the one who preserves his lineage, then he has a close, the one who preserves his ties of kinship, he has a close relationship even if the relative is distant. And the one who does not preserve his ties of kinship, then he has a distant lineage. My bad, a distant tie of kinship, a distant relationship, even if the relative is close to him. That's an authentic, I'm paraphrasing it of course, that is an authentic tradition worth checking out. And it is very important. Some people do not give much consideration to it, unfortunately, right? They don't see the weight of the matter, and therefore they preach this idea of taking the matter so lightly. Like if a woman was to marry her husband, right, her groom, she would just hey there, she would just change her family name to her husband's family name. She would literally desecrate her lineage, right? And that's a problem, right? If you look into even the Torah, the Old Testament, you would find in the first chapter verses after verses of lineages, right? The fathers of Noah, the fathers of Abraham. You'd find that. You will find tribes, right? The 12 tribes of Israel, etc. It's everywhere there. And you also find Allah Azza wa Jal, in the Quran, in the recital, He mentions favor over certain lineages, like the house of Noah or the house of Abraham, or even then you have also other examples like the house of Ishmael, right? And you have in the traditions the house of the Prophet ﷺ, peace and blessings be upon him, right? Like the line of Ali radiallahu anhu. And you also have rulings in the Sharia that is tied to lineage, like the system of kafa, suitability, right? The three schools, the Hanafi, the Shafi'i and the Hanbali school, they all give consideration to lineage and kafa, suitability. You have it in methodology. Another example of a ruling would be leadership and how it is tied to those from Quraysh, right? You have that tradition too. That again is tied to lineage. It is hereditary. You have an aristocratic system based on sacred law in Islam, and it's a reality which many people do not have awareness of. So you find jurisprudence al-fiqh tied to lineage. You also have it in methodology, like the virtue of one the line of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, being favored over those who are farther from him, and those lineages that are closer to the Prophet ﷺ is favored over those lineages that are farther from him. Barakallahu feekum, that's my 10 minutes. I hope it benefits you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The last one I'd like to leave is a tradition, right? There is a hadith where Ar-Raham, the ties of kinship, complained to God, and God said, is it not enough? And I'm paraphrasing. God said, is it not enough that I forbade your severance? That someone would sever the ties of kinship. God has prohibited that. There's a literal tradition of that. And subhanakallahumma wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa atubu ilayk.